They said the shot was impossible long before anyone even attempted to take it, long before the day turned metallic with cold, and long before the German armored column crawled like a chain of mechanical beetles through the valley. They said no rifle could do it, no man could calculate it, no bullet could survive the wind, gravity, drift, and sheer indifference of the universe over such an impossible distance. 2.6 miles. A distance so absurd that most maps didn't even bother to mark it with precision. A distance artillery officers played with, not riflemen. A distance that turned bullets into falling leaves. But the men who doubted had never met Corporal Elias Boone. He wasn't a hero to look at. He wasn't even particularly liked by most of the officers who thought he was too quiet, too methodical, too strange for a war that demanded noise and haste. Back home in Wyoming, he was the kid who shot mule deer at distances old ranchers swore were unreachable. He was the boy who spent summer afternoons lying prone for hours, adjusting his breathing until it matched the rhythm of the wind. He had learned to track turbulence in heat shimmer, to watch how dust lifted off the earth in different patterns, to see currents of invisible air swirl between hills. He was a student of silence, and silence repaid him by sharpening every sense he owned. In Europe, though, the army didn't quite know what to do with him. Boone wasn't a standard sniper. He wasn't the typical hunter-turned-soldier type who bragged about kills or carved notches into stocks. He was something quieter and more unnerving, like a measuring instrument disguised as a man. He treated his rifle as a laboratory experiment, not a weapon. He knew the chemical composition of his propellant powder. He could quote drop tables from memory. He'd once calculated bullet spin drift to the thousandth of a radian during a lull in fighting, scribbling numbers on a scrap of cardboard from a ration box. So the army placed him in a reconnaissance platoon, because no one knew where else to put someone who made officers uncomfortable. By February 1945, Boone had seen enough of the war to understand that most impossible things were just things no one had tried hard enough to figure out. Towns fell because people said they couldn't be held. Bridges were blown because someone said they couldn't be crossed. Men died because someone said saving them wasn't possible. War didn't reward imagination, it punished it. But that never stopped Boone from thinking in terms of what could be done rather than what couldn't. That mindset was why he happened to be on a ridge overlooking the frozen German-held valley near Hesselberg when the tank appeared. The landscape was a misery of winter ruin. Trees stood like shattered bones. Snow lay in patches, dirty and cratered. Every sound carried too far, bouncing off the hills in echoes that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. The morning sky was a pale, stained gray, the kind that never warmed beyond freezing even when the sun clawed its way up. Boone was with Lieutenant Harrington, a man who despised snow almost as much as he despised Boone's habit of staring into the distance without blinking. The lieutenant liked things simple. The enemy here, the Americans there, bullets in between. He had no patience for Boone's way of making war feel like mathematics. They were observing reported enemy movement, nothing more. Harrington expected a few infantry squads, maybe a half-track. What they got was a King Tiger. The tank crawled into view like an iron altar, its armor plates thick as steel doorways, its massive 88mm gun scanning the valley like an accusatory finger. Behind it followed two smaller Panthers, a supply truck, and a knot of infantry escort, a miniature armored column, moving south toward the nearest American position, the 41st Infantry's forward aid station, barely defended and full of wounded. Harrington cursed under his breath. "That tank punches through them," he said. "Everyone down there is dead in 20 minutes. Boone said nothing. He watched the tank through his scope, adjusting the magnification, testing the shimmer of cold air between him and the target. He could tell instantly it was too far for any normal shot. The tank was a faint shape, distorted by distance and frozen haze. But he kept measuring angles in his mind. Harrington grabbed the radio, calling for artillery support. Static answered. He tried again. Nothing. The valley curled inward, forming a natural bowl that swallowed radio signals. Boone finally spoke. "We're too far down in the terrain. Signal won't carry." "No kidding," Harrington snapped. "We need artillery or a bazooka team. Hell, we need anything." The Panther tanks were separating from the King Tiger now, maneuvering around the path leading to the American aid station. Boone looked through his scope again. He didn't say, "I can hit it." He didn't say, "Let me try." He only said, range is 2.6 miles. Maybe a little more depending on air density. Harrington stared at him like he'd lost his mind. A rifle shot, at that distance. Corporal, you couldn't hit the horizon. Boone didn't argue. He only began checking wind direction with a pinch of snow, watching how the flakes drifted. He set his rifle on his pack, then unpacked a battered metal box full of notes, charts, and a tiny homemade anemometer he'd built from scrap wires. Corporal, Harrington said sharply, what are you doing? Math, Boone answered. The lieutenant walked a few paces away, muttering to himself. Boone continued calculating. Elevation adjustment, spin drift, barometric pressure, humidity, bullet drop approaching hundreds of feet, flight time over 4 seconds. A million variables bent against him. But the German tanks were moving closer to the aid station. Terrifyingly close. Boone finished his calculations. Wind at 5 different layers, he murmured, mostly to himself. Temperature shift above the valley is about 10 degrees warmer. Air density changes drift by 15%. Earth's rotation adds a fraction. It'll have to be accounted for. He lifted the heavy-barreled .50 cal rifle the Army had assigned him months earlier, an experimental long-range weapon that he'd modified quietly in his spare time. He'd lapped the barrel, rebedded the action, fabricated a longer rail so he could mount a telescope meant for artillery spotting. It wasn't regulation, but no one checked because no one believed a man would bother modifying a weapon meant for distances the Army deemed unrealistic. Harrington returned and stood above him. You cannot be serious, the lieutenant hissed. Boone didn't look up. I can see the vent slits on the King Tiger's engine housing. That's the weak point from this angle. At 2.5 damn miles. 2.6, Boone corrected softly. This is insanity. It's the only shot we have. Harrington clenched his jaw, looking from the unfathomably distant tank to the quiet corporal lying prone in the snow. If you miss, Harrington said, they won't even know we're here. Boone didn't reply. He adjusted the rifle, measured wind again, corrected for the rising sun's thermal lift. Everything was fragile. If the wind shifted by so much as a whisper, the bullet would miss by hundreds of feet. Harrington finally exhaled. Do it. Boone slowed his breathing. He felt his heartbeat sinking with the rhythm of the wind, something he'd learned on the plains long before the war. His pulse slowed until it was almost a metronome. He pressed his cheek against the stock. Time thinned. Sound vanished. Distance collapsed into a single line between him and the German tank. He squeezed the trigger. Not pulled. Not jerked. Squeezed, the way a man carefully removes a splinter from a child's finger. The rifle roared. The recoil shoved into his shoulder. A shockwave rolled down the ridge. The bullet left the barrel spinning at supersonic speed, carving a spiral through frozen air. By the halfway point of its flight, it had already dropped dozens of feet. At a mile, hundreds. It began to arc, no longer rising but simply falling in a long, elegant curve shaped by physics, hope, and stubborn calculation. It reached the second thermal layer and drifted slightly left. Boone had predicted that. It slowed as the cold thickened around it. It fell again, picked up another sliver of tailwind, drifted right, then restabilized. The Germans never heard it. The bullet struck the King Tiger exactly at the engine vent. Armor that could withstand artillery shells had a weakness, a sliver-thin opening meant for airflow. The .50 cal round slipped through like a wasp finding a hole in a screen. For half a second, nothing happened. Then the engine compartment ignited in a violent, explosive cough of black smoke and shattered metal. Flames erupted through the vents. The tank shuddered to a halt. Its turret froze mid-rotation. The escorting Panthers veered off in panic. German infantry scattered. Harrington stood completely still. He knew the shot was good, but he didn't believe what he'd just seen. That was impossible, he whispered. Boone lifted his head from the scope, blinking as if waking from sleep. No, he said quietly. Just very unlikely. The column retreated in chaos. The American aid station was saved. The King Tiger burned for nearly an hour before its ammunition cooked off in a thunderous explosion that echoed through the valley like the end of a myth. News of the shot spread long before anyone bothered writing it in a report. Soldiers repeated it with awe, then skepticism, then awe again. Artillery officers argued about the math. Snipers claimed exaggeration. Commanders demanded proof. Some insisted it was coincidence. Others said Boone simply got lucky. But the men who were there that day knew better. They'd watched a quiet corporal look at a distance no sane man would consider, break it down into numbers, and bend it until it snapped into possibility. Boone never bragged. He never sought credit. When pressed about the shot, he only said, "Right conditions, right angle, right moment." But every man who served with him remembered something Harrington whispered hours after the German tanks fled. "He didn't just hit a tank. He hit the word, impossible."